Dorian Yates, the six-time Mr. Olympia champion who dominated professional bodybuilding through the 1990s, stated in a July 2024 episode of his own podcast that he would likely win if he competed in a modern Olympia lineup. He made the assessment directly, without qualification, drawing on 3 decades of observation of a sport he helped define. The bodybuilding community has been debating the statement ever since. In that same episode, Yates evaluated how today's professional competitors measure up against the top bodybuilders of the 1990s. His conclusion was straightforward. They do not. The physical evidence, the physiques, the competition records, the documented comparisons gives that position a degree of credibility that is difficult to dismiss outright. At the same time, current champions have offered their own responses. Both sides of that argument are worth examining. To understand why Yates holds the standing to make such a claim, it helps to look at what he actually achieved at the height of his career. Yates won the Mr. Olympia title 6 consecutive times from 1992 to 1997. He became known as the Shadow, a nickname given to him by journalist Peter McGough, because of his habit of competing without publicly confirming in advance whether he would appear. He neither confirmed nor denied his participation before major events, and would simply arrive on stage and win. During the years between competitions, Yates maintained a minimal public presence. While other competitors pursued guest posing appearances, magazine features, and industry events, Yates returned to Birmingham and trained at Temple Gym largely out of public view. He would then appear at the Olympia each year, presenting noticeably more size and conditioning than the year before. From 1992 until his retirement, he did not lose a single professional competition, 15 major wins, no defeats, 6 consecutive Olympia titles. Yates is widely regarded as the first of what the sport came to call the mass monsters, competitors who combined extreme muscular size with a level of conditioning that had not previously been achieved simultaneously. His physique was described as having a granite hardness, not simply large, and not simply lean, but both at once to a degree that forced a reassessment of what was physically attainable. That combination is precisely what he now argues is absent from the sport. At 5 feet 10 inches and competing between 255 and 265 pounds, Yates brought a degree of muscular density and conditioning to the Olympia stage that reset the standards against which competitors and judges measured elite physiques. At his second Olympia victory, he presented what many observers have described as the single greatest combination of mass and dry, full muscle conditioning the sport has seen. With that win, a new standard of size was established for the competition. The phrase "the best ever" comes up consistently when people discuss his peak conditioning. Not the best of his era, but the best in the history of the sport. His back in particular became the most referenced body part in any era-to-era comparison. When Rich Gaspari compared current champion Huddy Chupon's back to Yates's and said the conditioning wasn't close, he wrote that while bodybuilders today are considerably larger, they fall short of the dryness and definition that characterized the late 80s and 90s. That dryness does not exist, Gaspari wrote. That word dryness is central to what Yates has been arguing. What separated his era wasn't size alone. It was size combined with paper-thin striated conditioning that made every muscle appear deeply defined. In the July 2024 episode of the Shadow Talk with Dorian Yates podcast, prompted by guest Derek of More Plates More Dates, Yates spoke about how he would fare in the modern competitive landscape. The conversation moved to whether today's professionals could genuinely compare to the best of the 90s. His response was measured and direct, and it has continued to generate discussion within the sport. It's not the same standard anymore, he said, referring to what he sees as a decline in conditioning. It's like, why are all the guys very short? Why do they not have calves or forearms? Those two body parts, calves and forearms, are where Yates focuses when describing what is absent from modern physiques. He isn't offering broad criticism. He is pointing to specific visible deficiencies that the sport has gradually come to accept. It's not the same standard at all, he said. He went further, naming several bodybuilders he considers benchmarks of the era. Look, Flex Wheeler, Kevin Levrone, Ronnie Coleman. There's nobody that can match those guys in proportion, size, conditioning, the whole mix. Neither Wheeler nor Levrone ever won an Olympia. Yet Yates holds them up not as champions, but as representatives of the overall competitive standard, the level at which athletes who couldn't win in that era were still operating. The implication is that this baseline exceeded what today's title holders bring to the stage. Tolyu also connected the issue to a structural shift in the sport. Discussing overall participation relative to his era, he said if you had 10 million people doing something or 1 million people doing something, you'll have more outstanding genetic specimens in the 10 million than you would in the 1 million. More people are going to the gym, more gyms, but less people are doing bodybuilding. In the 80s and 90s, competitive bodybuilding drew athletes exclusively to one division and one destination, the Olympia stage. There was no classic physique, no men's physique, no 212, no wellness, no bikini. Every athlete with elite genetics competed in a single category. In the 80s and the 90s, every dude wanted to be a bodybuilder. That was it. Ambition in professional bodybuilding is now spread across more than a dozen categories, and Yates has argued that the talent pool for the open division has been permanently diluted as a result. Less competition at the top produces a lower ceiling, and a lower ceiling means athletes no longer need to be as extraordinary to win. That, in his view, is what the open division has become. So, in December 2025, Yates made his position considerably more explicit. In an Instagram post dated December 15th, 2025, he stated that Mr. Olympia competitors today look like refrigerators and no longer represent the ultimate male physique. He put it plainly, if you talk about the guys that are Mr. Olympia now and you show that to members of the public and tell them that's the ultimate male physique, well hold on, he's only like 5'4" or something, isn't he? He's like a fridge. How is that possible? The critique is specific. Yates sees the reigning champion as squat and blocky, width without height, mass without the proportions that make a physique broadly compelling. The argument is not that these athletes are unimpressive. It is that what is being rewarded no longer aligns with what Yates believes the Mr. Olympia title is meant to represent. A physical standard that would register as extraordinary to someone with no background in the sport. Yates is not the only former champion who holds that view. Lee Haney, the 8-time Olympia winner who held the record before Ronnie Coleman, has also noted that competitors have taken on a squat appearance. Haney found the 2025 Olympia outcome difficult to follow, and called for two separate classes within the open division, one for taller competitors and one for shorter. That a man who won the title 8 times is suggesting the division may need to be restructured by height is a notable development in the debate. Derek Lunsford, the 2-time Mr. Olympia champion and one of the more complete physiques competing at the elite level today, responded directly. Lunsford defended his era, writing, "This is a new era that has taken bodybuilding to a new level. We can respect the greats from the past, but this right now is the greatest moment in bodybuilding history." That response is notable for what it does not do. Lunsford does not dispute the technical comparisons to Yates' conditioning. He does not address the proportions argument directly. Instead, he reframes the terms of the debate. His era is not attempting to replicate the 1990s. It operates by different standards, and by those standards he argues the sport is at its highest point. It is a defensible position. Every generation of bodybuilding has produced critics from the one before it. Arnold Schwarzenegger's era viewed Lee Haney's as overly mass-focused. Haney's era considered Yates' approach too extreme. Yates' era felt Ronnie Coleman had pushed the sport past the point of aesthetic coherence. The pattern is consistent enough that it functions almost as a structural feature of the sport. Each preceding generation tends to view the one that follows as having moved in the wrong direction. Yates himself would likely acknowledge as much. Yates isn't arguing about aesthetics or personal taste. He's making a specific, verifiable claim about conditioning, body part development, and the physical standard required to compete at that level. On those points, the numbers and visuals are difficult to dismiss. The question that follows is straightforward. If prime Dorian Yates stepped on stage at a modern Mr. Olympia, what would happen? Yates addressed this directly on a July 2024 podcast, and his answer reflected the confidence of someone who went 6 years without a loss. When asked how he'd fare against the current field, he said, "No, I don't think I'd be losing a lot there." He described Lunsford's physique as top-heavy and noted he would need to bring up his legs. That response wasn't defensive. It was analytical, the kind of assessment a judge would make. In the same conversation, Yates offered what may be his most straightforward era-to-era comparison. The only competitor he would concede an edge to, across any hypothetical matchup, is Ronnie Coleman. In his words, probably Ronnie. He's the only one I'd say that. My competitive ego doesn't like it, but probably he would beat me. For a 6-time Olympia champion, widely considered among the greatest physiques the sport has produced, naming exactly one person across all eras as a likely victor is a notable position. That person is Ronnie Coleman, who succeeded Yates and extended the mass monster era further. Not the current champion, not any emerging competitor. Coleman alone. On the subject of other legends, Yates stated that a head-to-head between himself at his peak and Lee Haney at his peak would go in his favor, even though Haney defeated him in 1991. Yates acknowledged that result was deserved at the time, but holds that his ultimate peak exceeded anything Haney brought to the stage. Taken together, his position is consistent, confident he would beat today's field with relatively few adjustments, and placing only Coleman ahead of him in any hypothetical. That position reads less as arrogance than as a measured, self-aware assessment from someone who has spent decades analyzing the sport frame by frame. There is a specific element of Yates' critique that often gets overshadowed by the broader debate over hypothetical matchups, and it may be the more substantive point. He isn't simply arguing that today's competitors are smaller or less lean. He's identifying something structural, a shift in what the judging criteria rewards. Rich Gaspari, who competed primarily through the 1980s and 90s, stated plainly when comparing physiques across eras. Bodybuilders today are much bigger, but they are far from being dry and ripped like the bodybuilders of the late 80s and 90s. That dryness does not exist. Today's competitors are in many cases larger in sheer muscle mass. The sport has not regressed in size, but the level of conditioning, the extreme paper-thin dryness that Yates brought to the stage consistently throughout his career, has been gradually deprioritized. Judging standards have shifted, and competitors have trained accordingly. Yates's argument is that the conditioning benchmark has declined, and that physiques which would have placed lower in earlier eras are now winning. Ronnie Coleman, who knows elite conditioning better than almost anyone, looked at photos of recent Olympia competitors and laughed. "Nobody really looks in shape," he said. Kenneth Flex Wheeler, four-time Arnold Classic winner, made similar observations. This isn't one former champion defending his legacy, it's a consistent view shared by some of the greatest bodybuilders in the sport's history, across different eras, all identifying the same problem. Coleman's explanation is worth examining closely. It's a different era, you know? Everybody competes on a certain level, so they're looking at everybody else, they're like, well, they're not that good, so I'm gonna be just like them. The standard, in other words, doesn't collapse suddenly. It drifts, gradually, year by year, because competitors measure themselves against the current field rather than the all-time standard. When the all-time standard is no longer on stage, it stops functioning as a reference point. That is what Yates is pushing back against, not his own legacy, which is already established. He's arguing for the all-time standard to remain a reference point in a sport that has quietly moved away from it. The fridge comment wasn't only about Derek Lunsford's physique, it was about what the Mr. Olympia title is supposed to represent. For Yates, the Mr. Olympia is the ultimate male physique. He can appreciate what today's competitors bring, but maintains their physiques fall well short of what was on display in previous decades. That word ultimate carries specific weight. When Joe Weider created the Mr. Olympia in 1965, the original intent was precisely that, the most perfectly developed human physique on Earth. Not simply the largest, not simply the leanest, the most complete, proportionate, and impressive demonstration of what the human body can achieve. For Yates, and for a growing number of former champions watching from outside the sport, today's open division has moved away from that original standard and toward an emphasis on raw mass that makes physiques less visually compelling to anyone outside the dedicated competitive community. He stated, "It's not the same standard anymore. I'm happy I had my career when I had it because I could actually be the shadow." That final point is significant. He's saying the era created the conditions for a competitor like him to exist, someone who trained in complete secrecy and arrived with a physique so far ahead of the field that the gap was immediately apparent. In the current environment, with talent more broadly distributed and conditioning standards lower, that kind of gap may no longer be achievable. That is either evidence that today's field is more competitive, or that the ceiling has been lowered. On the question of whether Yates would win today, his answer is essentially yes, with the qualification that only Ronnie Coleman at his peak would reliably defeat him in any era. The current generation sees things differently. Derek Lunsford has said this is the greatest moment in bodybuilding history. Today's competitors believe the sport has reached a new level, and in terms of raw mass and certain aspects of muscle maturity, that position has some basis. There is, however, a distinction between evolving a sport and improving it. The debate Yates has kept alive through interviews, social media, and pointed commentary on calves, forearms, and conditioning centers on exactly that question. Has modern bodybuilding developed into something better, or has it moved away from the standard that defined it? Yates offered one final observation: fewer people want to compete in bodybuilding competitions. If less people do it, you're going to get fewer outstanding specimens. The logic is straightforward. A smaller talent pool produces fewer exceptional athletes at the top. For a sport that depends on the exceptional, that is a problem worth taking seriously. Yates competed in secrecy, won without fanfare, and spoke only when he had something specific to say. What he is saying now about the sport he helped define, and the competitors who have followed, is a debate the bodybuilding world will continue working through for years. Whether his era represents the peak, or one phase in a longer evolution, the fact that a man who last competed in 1997 can still generate this level of discussion is its own kind of evidence of how enduring his influence remains.